The objective today is to evaluate the level of vulnerabilities employees create in a company. And so this is going to be a short and sweet lesson about that. Just the idea that you yourself or people like you, employees, are often the biggest threat to a company. So with the title of this lesson being Yourself is Your Enemy, it's going to be a very introspective kind of lesson today. I will have a few analogies, a few examples, and I'll throw in some comics for humor, which is good for memory, kind of like reading this maybe. And then we're just going to go over quite a few terms in terms of what policies are out there for companies. So the overall theme I would say of today's lesson is don't let the beauty or wonderfulness you see in people stop you from stopping them from harming themselves or the company and organization that you guys both work for. With this theme, I wanted to start with pictures from Griffith Park. Really beautiful, right? This overlook of Los Angeles. I used to live in Southern California, and though it is very beautiful in so many parts, there's a lot of ugliness as well. And I don't think it's always like ugliness on purpose. And that's sort of like, again, the theme of today's lesson, that we as people are going to do things that are not necessarily thought all the way through and thus can create vulnerabilities inside of companies or organizations. So I offer this analogy to you guys in the beginning of the lesson to just think about your personalities. And for me, I don't think my personality would be very good in the security field. I am just too friendly of a person and just too positive. I really like calm environments. If you're in my class, you know that I'm just happiest when everybody's just chill. So this personality I have is probably good for being a teacher, but not necessarily for the security field, where you have to be maybe rough with people and insisting that they don't get as much freedom as they may want. The point is, the people are the weakest link in a company's security, and you have to train your people and you have to restrict them. Two things humans are not always receptive to, and that is learning, thus the training, and limits. If you're not brought up in an environment where you learn to love learning, then learning is not something you're going to embrace, and neither, of course, nobody, that is, seems to embrace limits for understandable reasons. So for your first note of the day, maybe write employees are a massive threat. And this may not seem like it on the surface, but they can be reckless, they can be treacherous on purpose. Sometimes they do these things on accident, such as downloading a virus or storing credentials, that is username and passwords in plain sight. Maybe they have a file on their computer on the desktop that says passwords, and that's a collection of all their passwords. That's a horrible idea. Or they may divulge sensitive information, again, either on accident or on purpose. But that is why I say employees are such a massive threat. And one time somebody told me about somebody else who was just writing their passwords on a piece of paper and keeping it that way. And they were saying it in a way as to ridicule the other person, but I don't think that's a very bad idea. I mean, if you have to do it, if you have a piece of paper with all your passwords and usernames written down, and you use that instead of using a text file on your computer of the same information, that piece of paper, that physical thing, is a better idea than the desktop. Well, or at least it can be, depending on where you keep that paper. If you're a student in a class and you're carrying that paper around, bad idea. If you have it in your wallet, okay, a better idea. You don't often pull your wallet out. Or if in your house, under your bed, in a lockbox, you have this paper, maybe that's a much better idea in terms of where to store that thing. For me, I would suggest this. And if I suggest something, I typically am doing that thing. I would never write my passwords down, and I don't. And I don't memorize them. I don't know a lot of them, but I have gone a step further than what products like LastPass do. I write myself hints to what my passwords are. And only a person like myself who journals often, who just thinks about their life often and reflects on the things that happen to them, could read my notes and understand what I'm going with. I have some ridiculous notes to myself that I know are ridiculous, and it's what do they call that, a red herring? Yeah, it's a red herring, something that's designed to be misleading, so I know it's a red herring. People who obviously participate in murder mysteries will want to avoid red herrings. But with that said, I'm writing myself notes and not just the write out answer, and that's how I manage my passwords. And again, for students who have not taken my other classes or watched my other videos, the key to a strong password more than anything else is length. The longer the password is, I know it's a pain to type it all out, but if you go with this pattern idea, a pattern of nonsensical things, then that will help you with password strength. Okay, length is strength. So it's vital that an employee realize their position is the most volatile. Attackers' primary goal is to leverage off one person's workstation, granting them access eventually, whether it's sooner or later, to the rest of the system. And through this one worker, that is what the attackers are looking to do. This is why it's important to educate them, because an uneducated worker, employee, is a much easier target. And sometimes these attackers, once they get into the system, they could be there for days, months, even years before people realize it. The last time I checked, the average time a person is in a network without anyone knowing is 200 and some days. I want to say I got that number from an IBM security podcast, but needless to say, the attacker or the bad guy could certainly be in there for a long time before anybody even realizes it. So here's a good thing I share for you. How would you go about training a company of maybe non-technical people or people who just are not computer savvy about security, about this idea that they are the weakest link in the chain? And I'm imagining everybody can identify with this idea that one of the most popular attacks is called a phishing attack. So this might come in the form of an email with a link or an attachment file that will execute malicious code once the user clicks on it. I mean, that's all they have to do in order to initiate the attack is click something. And this is where basics of computer understanding or computer science understanding is essential for a cybersecurity class, because the user, the person who clicks or types on a keyboard, they have great power in allowing certain blocks of code to start executing. So you might wonder, how is it that a click can be so damaging? Well, it's just how computers work. These emails will seemingly be from typically someone that you know, and typically they'll try to make it an urgent request, not always, but sometimes. Or they'll make the email seem like it came from a higher up in your company, someone you trust or someone you're used to following orders or directions from. The classic Nigerian prince email scam worked when people were more naive in regards to the internet. So this is a famous phishing scam during a time when people just didn't understand these things that I'm explaining to you now. Now, if you're a young person watching this, these phishing attacks may be nothing new to you. But I want to warn you, even a cybersecurity professor such as myself has fallen victim to these attacks because they're getting more clever. And if they weren't getting more clever and they weren't successful, then the attackers wouldn't use them anymore. But clearly they have still proven to be effective enough for the hackers to use their time creating them. So here's my story. One time I got an email from an old friend of mine, and so I known her for very many years. And she's a librarian, so she just has this aura of trust about her. So I get this email, and the email's titled check this out, and then it's just a link. And so, man, I don't know what I was thinking that day. She often sends me Star Trek stuff on Facebook. So I just thought this was another hey, look at this Star Trek meme, or, new release for something Star Trek related. So I clicked it, but then it occurred to me that she had always been sending these through Facebook, never email, and that somebody must have just used her name, and that's how they got my trust. And I didn't even really look at the email address. I just looked at the, on Gmail, it just has the last name, then first name. I just looked at that. So it took me only 3 seconds to realize this after clicking, because it was taking a little time to load. And so I immediately closed the browser. I pulled the power cord out and then pulled the battery out and then just sat there for a while thinking about what a mistake I made. And I picked up my phone and of course started texting her to double check that my paranoia was justified. And it was justified. When I turned my computer back on, everything was fine, and everything seems to have been fine. I also like to check my bank accounts very often, and I use a website called Credit Karma to just make sure like no random accounts are being opened in my name. So, I mean, there's just that was a few years ago, and there's nothing that seems to have come from it. I can't specifically tell you why nothing came from it, but that was a bullet I felt like I barely dodged. And here I am, a teacher of cybersecurity, and I still made a mistake like that. So don't get too arrogant or don't get too confident. You always have to maintain vigilance here. So it's important to notice that not all threats come from outside of the company. An unsatisfied employee can do quite a bit of damage inside the network. This forces companies to train their employees on how to recognize someone that is about to cause a lot of damage. So that's important as well. And I mean, for me, in a school setting, it's important to know when somebody's not doing good. Everybody has a bad day, but if somebody's having a lot of bad days or something's going on, I'm hoping that in every environment, school or work, there are people there to support other people and to help them out. I'm afraid certain things in our maybe society, or you want to call it the system, certain things make that difficult to do. But if you're in my class or a person who knows me, let's continue to work together to try to make sure people are taking care of people. There's a way to report if you can't help somebody. There's a way to report your fear or your anxiety over their behavior, and so you should do that for sure. I don't want you to spend too much time on this Think Right Share, but I still want you to just do a little thinking on what could make an employee unhappy enough to cause harm. And with an answer, whatever answer you have to this question, now you could start thinking of preventative measures to keep people from A, being unhappy, and B, just being able to cause harm. Okay, so there needs to be a way to properly secure data while also having it readily available to the right people. So this is our part of the job of a cybersecurity specialist, right? This CIA thing we talk about in class, this stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Like these are the three things that we are trying to ensure through our profession. So the question is, how are these three values related to employees being the weakest link? So let's go a little bit into integrity and a little bit in terms of confidentiality. So integrity, there is a difference between identification and authentication. Now, identification is simply the act of claiming that you are you. The typical way to authenticate this fact is usually with a username and password. So authentication means there's some provable way to show that the identity is who the person says it is. Now, I'm a fan of two-factor authentication, and I want you to do a quick prediction right here. Again, good for the brain, good for learning to make predictions. What could this word two-factor authentication mean? Of course, if you already know it, go ahead and prove it. I like to say that to my students. They say something like, I can already do this, or I already know this. I'm like, prove it. And if you like these kind of comics, I'm a big fan. The teacher says, let's assume there exists some function, f with a, b, c parameters. And this produces the correct answer. So then the student says, wait, hang on. Is this going to be one of those weird dark magic proofs? Isn't it? I can tell. So we're talking math proofs here. So then the teacher's like, what? No. It's a perfectly sensible chain of reasoning. Student reluctantly says, all right. And now the teacher goes on to say, let's assume the correct answer will eventually be written on the board at coordinates x and y. And then the student laughs at that teacher's idea of what proving it means. So since I'm sharing comics about teachers, here's just another one I wrote down here that it's a little off topic, but I still think it's funny. So this teacher says there exists some number x such that the function of x equals all that, okay? Then the teacher says, oh yes, somewhere out there it exists, and we must find it and destroy it. Grab your swords, students, we ride. And then the student says, I think I'm in the wrong math class. The other student says, I'm finally in the right one. So teachers with a sense of humor are great, especially if that sense of humor relates to any type of swords and sorcery for me. Okay, so let's focus. Two-factor is not complicated and a great idea to set up. I use two-factor on a lot of accounts. All you have to do is find two ways to authenticate yourself. So be it a thumbprint and a pattern for your phone. So my phone has that little print reader. Or it could be a text message that comes with a code, or for my Google accounts, it's a message that says, "Are you trying to log in?" I just click a button that says yes. And then, of course, I had used my username and password combination to even get that text message in the first place. So two-factor authentication, a great idea to use. Now I want you to take this a step further. Were you able to first of all, correct predictably? And second of all, so you're doing some reflecting right there, good for the brain. Second of all, now that you know more details about two-factor authentication, give me a detailed explanation of what two-factor authentication is. And another example of having to prove something, I'll let you read this comic on your own. So almost done here. There are 4 ways to prove you are you and not your enemy. So the categories are something you are, something you have, something you know, and something you do. So take a quick shot at this. What can you do to show you are you? What could you have in your possession that could prove you are you? And what could you know that's very unique, only you would know it maybe? And then what could you do? Again, to prove that you are the person who you are claiming to be. Something you are is similar to a biometric scan, so like a fingerprint or retina. That's not something that changes. Something you have could be like a smart card or an RSA token or a security key fob. Ubiquity, I think, is a company that sells something to, a physical thing to have to prove you are who you are. Somewhere you are is a good one, so that's a geographic location. If somebody starts logging into my Google accounts from other geographic locations, I'll get a message confirming that I am in that location. Same with my credit card company. If I start spending money in other states for some reason, they just check to make sure if I'm on vacation or if somebody has stolen my card. And then, of course, something you do is like how you type a sentence. This one's deep. So there are computer programs out there that measure and evaluate your rhythm of typing or the way you do something. Even the way you walk can be measured and tested to see if you are who you are. Sounds like something from a Mission Impossible movie. And I think that new Punisher series even had an old NSA agent looking at a person's gait. That is the way they walk to see if they are who they are claiming to be, or who they're dressed up to be at least. Okay, another good idea here is mutual authentication. So this is where the server has to prove its validity to the user. And that type of relationship, I think, you guys might not think of very much. So when you go to a website, how do you know that website is the one you intended to go to in the first place? So you think right here, do you think this is a good idea? And do you have any idea how this would work? I'm not going to reveal the answer of that one today, but I want you to take a stab at it. Another policy to have in a company is transitive trust. So if A trusts B, then B trusts C, then A would then also trust C. This is something Microsoft does. So your think right share here. Is this a good idea? What could go wrong? Another policy idea is the principle of least privilege. So this is giving users their ability only to do their job and not anything else unnecessarily. So although some people may think that this is just being strict, it prevents privilege escalation, which can be a difficult problem to track if the privileges are granted to all employees. So here's your think right share. Imagine you have to speak at a meeting or write an email to all employees and you're convincing them to accept this policy of least privilege. So basically what this would mean is you're telling the custodian, since he doesn't have to be on the internet to do his or her job, then they don't get internet access or internet privilege. Like, that's kind of tough to convince people of. So go ahead and take a shot at it here. And here's our last one. 2 more ideas. Implicit deny would be the automatic decline of any access to a resource that users don't typically use. And then the separation of duties is the idea that it takes more than one person to complete a task, so no one person has end-to-end control, and no one person can then be removed from that task. So that's the end of the lesson. Just rank these precautions in order from highest to lowest. Look forward to your answers.